Let's have a talk, let's have a chat, talking about a little this and that. Hello and welcome to This and That. We're still hosting Daughter of Zion Eternally, and she is finishing her study on the Jewish roots of Christendom because it be a Jewish thing. To listen to more of her work on This and That, you can go to talkingaboutthисandthat.wordpress.com and click on podcasts. In our last episode, we started talking about the concept of the soul of humanity and the connection of that with the shedding of blood to satisfy sin. We will be wrapping up this series today. Today, the idea of created by God is seen as, quote-unquote, antique. But to God, that word, antique, might actually be offensive because he is eternal, ever fresh, and new, not at all antique. For it is solely by him that existence continues. What do I mean by that? Existence, I mean quantumly. Dark matter, dark energy, and it's called dark because we can't see it in space, which is dark. Go somewhere where there isn't a lot of light pollution, look up at night, and tell me, beyond the stars, without clouds, what else do you see? Dark. Why do we have street lamps and headlights and flashlights at night? Because it's dark. Right. So, let's get back to Adam. Genesis 2:7. In the New King James, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being, quote unquote. American Standard Version, quote, and Jehovah formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul, unquote. Young's literal translation, quote, and Jehovah God formed the man, dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils breath of life, and the man became a living creature, unquote. Being, soul, creature. These words imply that though formed of the elements of the planet, upon completion there lay this perfectly formed and integrated marvel with the capacity to automatically regulate all the functions of taking in air and liquid and solid and eliminating toxins and wastes and processing nutrients out of all that is ingested to keep the physical body going. And that's just the basics. But if the first breath never happened, and it is not made animate or made alive, however you truly can define this very perfect work will succumb to another law. The second law of thermodynamics, meaning it would decompose. But along came the third person of the Trinity and breathed life into the nostrils. The first breath. The first breath? No. The being was created to draw in the air like a baby draws in its first breath with its shrill wail. But the baby is born alive. This perfect being is dead. It not only doesn't have the lungs opened in the first breath, but quite possibly has not brain function either to take in any breath, let alone a first or next breath. If it were a matter of aeration, the Spirit would be breathing into us continuously. Of course, who's to say that he's not? After all, who is our next breath anyway? Something to think about. No, this is something more. And here's the Jewish and Hebraic thought that goes by the name of the nephesh. Remember the last episode we mentioned the nephesh, the soul, a living soul, atonement for the soul. I have said it to my children and my mother like this: our brain is the fastest computer ever created. Our bodies are the most intricate and perfectly run machine ever created. AI has yet to master the intricacies of the brain or the body. We are just that complex, but all computers and machines need an operator. AI has to be programmed. That operator might be considered metaphysically to be the soul, the seat of decision, wherein the actions of sin are thought up or without desiring or committed anyway. As operators, we can plan to perform activities such as speech or reactively to respond to stimuli and perform activities like speech. Speech can become an action of the rest of the body, as in, I say I'm going to punch out your lights, and then I punch out your lights. Physical work follows a spoken word. But the operator is called in the New Testament not a soul, but an inner man. Ephesians 3:14 through 19, quote, "For this reason I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you according to the riches of his glory to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints that which is the width and the length and the depth and the height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God," unquote. This is the great representation of the point. The prayer is that of Christ something may be communicated or imparted unto us. Verse 17. The Christ may live or dwell in the heart. Verse 16 talks about being strengthened in the inner man. Here's a better example. 2 Corinthians 4:16. Quote, "Therefore do not lose heart, but though our outer person is decaying, yet our inner person is being renewed day by day." Unquote. Inner man, inner person. Notice the outer and the inner comparisons, and that the outer is perishing, but the inner is not. Decay is to the physical body, which no longer takes in the breath, or has awareness, or is conscious, or interactive. We say that person has, quote-unquote, passed away. They are no longer, quote-unquote, among us. And yet, there's the body of the person all decked out and pretty in a casket. They are most certainly with us, are they not? By the way, there are ancient cults, Aztecs, Mayans, the South American civilizations, that dressed up their dead and enshrined them and talked to them and prayed to them and thought that they were talking back, or worshipped them, venerated them, because the body was what they considered with the person still there. Okay, fair enough. Our ability to elicit a response no longer exists, and then wait a while, and there's a certain smell that begins in earnest, and it's as this very pretty body decomposes, even with what we do for embalming, eventually it decomposes, just takes longer. I mean, you don't die and have a viewing right on the same day. Come on, folks. It's a lot of paperwork, a lot of stuff, and money. It takes a lot of money. So, because this process happens, something is missing. The point here is, in a dead body, something is missing. That something is the inner man, the soul, the nephesh, the human spirit. It is also that in the giving of that first life, that first perfect body on the ground, that one day, God gave unto man that which would start the heart, operate the lungs, to move the fluid called blood throughout the body, to give it food and oxygen, and thus cause it to continue on functioning, and in functioning to support the framework for the operator to remain on the earth. This person looking out, and now this is as I told my children and my mother, this person looking out our eyeballs. This is the person enjoying the view, thinking the thoughts, dreaming the dreams, and sinning the sins. This is, or might be considered by way, to be part of the human nature. This is also where Jesus becomes unique among all created men, because he has two natures. They are distinct and separate as an apple and an orange, but they are together contained within his flesh and blood body. They communicate. His created human nature, which is not nephesh. Jesus never had a human spirit. There are those today, and even I strayed into that thinking myself briefly, who propose that Jesus had not only a human body, but also a human soul and a divine nature together in human flesh. This simply is not scriptural. Sorry. Let's put it this way. They communicate, these two natures, his divinity and his humanity. They communicate. It's God as though we were not man, and man as though we were not God. All right? When we look into other people's eyes, we see the intelligence or the mind. You might also call the inner man the workings of the mind, the intellect, the emotions, the pathos. Even in those who have been profoundly impaired in their mind, in their brains, as to be in a vegetative state, there is still something in their quote-unquote humanity. It's extremely hidden, but it's there because they're still alive. If you're still breathing on your own, that spirit is still there. Now, if you were to take your time machine and go back in time, and you would have run into Jesus, walking around, looking for all the world like just another Jewish rabbi, and you looked into that man from Nazareth's eyes, you would see something very different. The men of his day did not grasp what they saw. But any time a demon looked at Jesus, they simply knew. In fact, they cringed and wheezed about this day of torment and the possibility of God coming to execute that day before its time, quote unquote. Before its time, quote unquote. Matthew 8:29, Luke 4:34. These are those encounters. Read it for yourself. Now, what you would have seen, had you been alive in that day, would have been the divine Son, second person of the Trinity, he who is the uniquely only begotten of the Father. This nephesh, as it were, is not a soul. It's the direct personage of the one true and living God, the uniquely only begotten of the Father, he who is called the Son. So, as Jesus will talk about being Son of Man, according to some theologians, he's referring to Daniel. It is indeed his messianic and favorite title. I argue the point that while he is referring to Daniel 7:13, wherein Daniel records, quote, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, unquote. That would be Jesus himself making the equation, and by the way, and Jesus himself makes the same allusion to that verse, an equation before the high priest in Mark 14:62 and Luke 22:69, quote, you will see the Son of Man, there it is again, seated at the right hand of the power and coming with clouds of heaven, unquote. The point he makes is that his resurrected form, in that form, will take its rightful place still in the human appearance, but risen. It is only in his taking on the quote-unquote human condition of being a human being that he is human as though he were not God. Thus, when Jesus is raised up from the crown on that cross, just like Judas hanging from the tree branch, he becomes accursed. In bearing of this curse, voluntarily the door is open to bring against the Son of God any and all, including Adamic sin, to bear on this one individual as he is dying the death and bleeding. It is this dual nature, the fact that he has two distinct separate natures. The one being the absolute divine Son, God the Son himself, taking unto himself the nature, the covering of the other, which is a Jewish male body born, as is all humanity, from the, quote, seed of the, quote, woman, or, quote, virgin. Genesis 3. The seed that crushes the other seed, the seed of the woman that crushes the seed of the serpent. This is that seed. This is that fulfillment. Mary goes through the whole process of a pregnancy to give birth to her firstborn male son, a boy who will actually be devoted to God for destruction. Yes, he was quote-unquote redeemed by his parents upon his circumcision because he wasn't to be destroyed yet. Listen, if you don't redeem the baby, they have to kill it. Human sacrifice is not permitted on the Jewish temple altar. So you offered the animal, you paid the price, and you redeemed the firstborn child. Of course he was redeemed. Boy, the baby's got to grow up to be a man. Go do the work. And then he's going to voluntarily devote himself to the destruction as a sacrifice. He lived the life, and he did it according to the pleasure of the Father. So in no manner did Jesus, who walked about, a man before men as far as humanity has ever understood it. And yet this is just the nature of human form, so that all that was planned might begin its fulfillment. We're talking about Old Testament prophecies going all the way back to God's pledge to Eve. Who was the first prophet? God himself. Yet, make no mistake, as the divine Son, Jesus actually has all the power and all the life within him because he is God. His hupotasso, or abiding under, is taking his cues from his Father, always going away unto prayer to commune with his Father. Yet for all his divinity and unboundedness, the divine Son has to endure the process of the maturation of his human nature, to see properly, to begin to understand speech mentally, to walk, to potty train, to speak, to read, to write. All of this is humiliation on the one hand. He who is divine is also now to be the servant of men and to his Father, which in his exalted position as the Son is also humiliation, not to act on his own initiative, as he would say, the Son of Man does nothing that the Father has not first shown him. John 15:19, quote, Then Jesus answered and said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever the Father does, the Son also does in like manner. John 15:30, quote, I can of myself do nothing as I hear, I judge. And my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. Unquote. Both these statements mean the right of choice is handed over to the Father. Also, when Satan says to Jesus to command the stones to become bread, Jesus replies with Scripture, does nothing to the stones. All right, remember the wedding at Cana and the water. Mom says, oh, son, they've run out of wine. Anybody else would have said, oh, mother, send somebody to go buy some more. But not this son. He kind of says, and the problem is, and what is this to do with me? My time hasn't come. But she kind of pushes the issue when she tells the servants, whatever he tells you, just do it. There are these huge water pots, stone water jars, for the ritual purification stuff, washing and stuff. They're not full of water. So the first thing Jesus says is, these should have stayed full. Go fill them. So they do. Then he says to one of the servants, okay, you take the dipper, put it in the cup, pick it over to the MC, the master of ceremonies. Hand him the cup. You got to love it. Because this is the command these stones to become bread moment. Jesus didn't do it. But something moves the Father to have Jesus make a miracle. The MC takes the cup, drinks from it, and the servant is probably thinking, oh, that's just going to be water. I'm so dead. But the MC lights up like a Christmas tree and is like, go get the bridegroom. Bridegroom comes up to him, and he's holding this cup, and he looks at the bridegroom and he says, most of us, when we have drunk ourselves stupid, the bridegrooms bring out the garbage from the back of the cellar. You saved your best vintage for now? Wow, dude, you're something else. Best wedding feast ever. You realize that for the rest of the wedding feast, the guys in the back are dipping into the water pots and filling the containers to bring it out to the participants, to the celebrants, to pour, and it's wine. Turn this rock into bread. No. Turn this water into wine. Yes. Cellular transmutation, folks. He can do it, but he doesn't, because it's not what his Father wants. It's about will with Christ. This is how the covenant works, by the way, also. Staying in step with the will of God. The law only expresses the will of God, the nature of his holiness. Enough said. This not turning the stones into bread means that he can do, like I just said, he can, but he chooses not to. This is a faith that is singular in vision and scope, coupled with a knowledge leading to an implicit trust that believes nothing out of order will be done so as to cause the will of the Father to be aborted. Not Jesus' will, but Jesus' Father's will. In this do we have the correct understanding of Philippians 2:7, or the kenosis explained, but made himself no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, coming in the likeness of men, New King James, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men, New American Standard, but did empty himself the form of a servant, having taken in the likeness of man, having been made, Young's literal translation. Nay, he stripped himself of his glory and took on him the nature of a bondservant, becoming a man like other men. Weymouth's New Testament. Remember the pastoral prayer of John 17? Glorify your Son with the glory which I had with you before becoming flesh. Right. Remember a certain mountain and three guys and the Lord, where Jesus goes from being apple pan dowdy to shiny Jesus? So, we as humans do not have a soul. We are a soul. A soul that departs after the life capacity of the human body ceases for whatever reason. If you break the body so that system no longer integrates, you have a catastrophic damage like a paralysis and still wake up and live a new normal. But if you break that system bad enough that the brain part can't regulate the vitally important heartbeat and air intake and output or breathing, once that stops, without nutrition of oxygen to cause the cells to work as one and the cells composing organs to function, you have a problem. No blood is moving, no cellular sustenance and air is getting into the cells, and the organs like the heart and the lung and the brain, without which nothing else is running in a body, die. The blood spoils in the vein and separates out. It will never recompose short of a miracle. It can no longer feed the body, even if the motor of the heart is restarted. It will not work for long. That's why if you're an organ donor, they put you on a heart-lung machine to keep the body aerated. Right. Until they can take the parts. Right. That's why they put all the parts on ice. Right. If you break the skin of the system and it leaks out its vital nutrient, the supplier of nutrient called blood, if it leaks out enough, there isn't enough to pump. The pump runs dry and stops. The issue is that once this death or cessation of the physical host happens, the occupant or operator must depart for another place. The whole point of the gospel is there are two places you might go: heaven with God, hell away from God. In the article weekly.israelbiblecenter.com/the-soul-or-the-spirit, the writer Dr. Nicholas J. Chasser makes this point about the reality of the soul in Jewish thought. Quote, while Genesis 2 refers to the, quote, breath of life, unquote, Nishmat Hayim, the, quote, spirit of life, unquote, appears shortly thereafter. Before the flood, God resolves to, quote, destroy all flesh in which the spirit of life, Ruach Hayim, unquote, is. Genesis 6:17 and following, 7:15 and 22. The similar phrases highlight the connection between the divine, quote-unquote, breath that forms the human, quote-unquote, spirit. In fact, most English translations translate, quote, spirit of life, unquote, as, quote, breath of life, unquote, since the concepts are so closely related, whereas the Greeks posit, quote, a soul. The Hebrew speaks of, quote, a spirit that God breathes into human being. I'm sorry, that quote ends at divine breath that forms the human spirit. All right. So, the soul or inner man is understood by the New Testament writer of Paul, who is Jewish to begin with, as the person himself. And that person is spirit. The connection of that spirit with our blood is in that they are bound together, as long as the blood flows, the spirit remains. But if you stop the blood or lose it, the spirit departs. What does this say about Jesus, who is divine? Not a human spirit, not a nephesh, not a soul, divine. Taking on humanity, whose very desire or choice or will to action in thought, word, or deed is wholly given over to his Father. This is a subservience of the will of the Son to the will of the Father at every point in the life of the Son in the body of flesh and blood on earth, up to and including every point of his dying process, right up to the point where he gives up his spirit, and that's it. One would think that it implies that this is not only a human body, but also a human spirit or nephesh or soul or person of the man with the spirit of the divine nature as well, and they would be wrong. As I said previously, Jesus has no human soul, no human nephesh, only a human body. Because only in a human body can he, as the Son, be beaten, sleep-deprived, assaulted, with damage to the skin, bleeding profusely, having spikes driven into the upper and lower extremities in order to bear the weight of the frame of the body on an upright post with a horizontal bar seated on it, everything securely lashed and nailed in place, and there he is. Not only now is he bleeding from the whipping post, but from the spike points as well, lest we forget the thorn crown of Judean thorn, which is quite long, which is digging into his scalp. They left that on. He's also experiencing an internal trauma from the effects of feeling the hot displeasure and wrath of the one whom in his experience has always been cooperative and pleasant to live with. There has always been peace between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and now there is war. No wonder that cry rends out in the darkest of hours. Folks, that which allows him to animate that body is slowly leaking out. Given also the emotional and spiritual toll of the day, it's a wonder that he finally is done with the whole thing. His father, everything that his father has desired and dictated, every detail to perform, making his statements, and when he's finally done, he gives up the ghost. Anyone reading that in the King James Version knows that ghost is spirit. This is why the votive offering of the Passover plate is a boiled egg, yolk of self and soul and nephesh, spirit bound within the white of the inner flesh and the shell of the outer flesh. That's how we come to understand it. That's how it's been explained. Oh, and by the way, it's taken. Guess what? You crack the shell and you eat the egg. White yolk and all. It's boiled. It isn't because a man was beaten, humiliated, and spiked to a Roman cross and lost blood all over the place that his death was so important. It's because this man is the divine second person of the Godhead who has chosen to take on the form of a man, to take on himself the flesh and blood, shell of mortality and fragility, and then pour out that which gave his flesh life, its blood, so that we who God the Father has chosen before the foundation of the earth might never be required to pour out our blood for salvation. What we have is his holy, perfect life poured out in blood before God at the altar in temple/tabernacle. And with it, he himself is literally being poured out before his Father. In his divinity, he offers up the human sacrifice, not in fire unto a deity of no God status, but in a selfless, willing act, knowing that this one life will fully be all the blood-based sacrificial system requires to atone, remove, or blot the sin in expiation and bring pleasure of satisfaction unto God, that he may no longer look in angry wrath at those who were chosen from before the founding of the cosmos itself to be his in propitiation. The greatest reconciliation that is accomplished is Adam's sin paid. Beyond that, every breach of covenant or commandments listed in Mosaic law, beyond that, going forward in time to every breach of covenant, even I, the reader, and the person who's putting out this podcast, and daughter of Zion, who wrote all this, would ever do, save for sins of a high hand. Ourselves, as in our personhood, or that which makes us unique individuals, is bound to this mortal body by the flowing of our blood. But for believers, a day will come after they put this mortal, poured-out body in a new tomb, a day when that which was cast off and spent physically, that could die of Jesus, was suddenly and instantly burned up or consumed in the fire, quote-unquote, of resurrection. That fire was the answer of God to his sacrifice, for he died unburnt by human hands and was buried whole, but without enough blood perhaps to carry on the life to heal. Nor was after this accomplished Jesus willing to live, but to come to the full executed death of himself, giving in the death as the countless animals had to give unto death before him, just as the carcasses parts are consumed on the fire that is never allowed to go out, and the rest often burned outside the camp, with only the reserved meat portion devoid of blood of life given over to a priest for food. So Jesus' leftover physical body is consumed in that what makes the transformation of every molecule of his corpse into, quote-unquote, something else. Like I've said, all that Christendom is has come from Judaism or Israel. It is its own entity now, but the roots be a Jewish thing. It has been interesting to delve into this connection of Jewish roots. For the Daughter of Zion, this is Mary Easterling, for This and That. We will be hosting more of the Daughter of Zion's work in the future. For now, if you wish to hear from more on This and That, go to talkingaboutthисandthat.wordpress.com and click on the podcast links. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and it's all free. Until then...